EVO.
Welcome back to The Devil Within. This is Sean Sellers, The Making of a Killer. Chapter 4, The Confession Tapes. From death row, in a concrete echo chamber lit by flickering fluorescence and watched by cameras that never blinked, Sean Sellers began the next chapter of his life not with a scream, but with a whisper. It started, as many redemption tales do, with paper and ink. Letters, apologies, reflections, claims of salvation, and most notably, a change in allegiance. By 1990, 5 years into his incarceration at the Oklahoma State Penitentiary, Sean Sellers announced to the world that he had converted to Christianity. And not merely as a last-ditch effort for reprieve, his supporters would argue, but as a full spiritual transformation. The self-proclaimed demon prince of death row now quoted the Gospel of John. He had burned his satanic materials in a symbolic fire and replaced his invocations with prayers. He said he was no longer possessed. Now he was saved. He began to record tapes, hours of testimony addressed to churches, to youth groups, to schools. They were mailed out across the country, duplicating in the hands of ministers and conservative evangelists. These tapes became the new voice of Sean Sellers, far more refined than the rambling journals discovered in his teenage bedroom. He spoke of the dangers of Satanism, warning that even curiosity could become damnation. He described his former self as a vessel, corrupted by evil forces that prey on adolescent discontent. To some, he sounded like a preacher. To others, like a practiced actor reading lines before an unseen audience. But Sellers wasn't content with only religious audiences. He reached out to journalists and academics, often in long, handwritten letters bearing his precise, curling signature. He was articulate. He was often very persuasive. He painted himself as a misunderstood teenager caught in the grip of mental illness and occult fantasy. His supporters grew. Among them were human rights activists, psychologists, clergy, and eventually, Amnesty International. They argued that Sean Sellers was a clear violation of evolving international norms. Executing someone for a crime committed at age 16, they said, placed the United States in company with the few remaining nations still willing to kill its own children. These arguments gained traction overseas, but met colder reception at home. American courts had no appetite for reversal. Meanwhile, mental health experts weighed in. Some claimed Sellers had suffered from undiagnosed dissociative identity disorder, a condition once cited during his trial, but dismissed. They pointed to his dissociative behaviors, the conflicting personalities detailed in his own journals, and his own insistence that he had no memory of the murders. He wasn't evil, they argued. He was fractured. He was broken. But the courts, bound by precedent and skeptical of psychological revisionism, remained unmoved. Appeals were filed and denied in quick succession. Clemency requests were submitted to the Oklahoma Pardon and Parole Board, every one of them rejected. For prosecutors, the case remained unchanged. 3 lives taken in cold blood, with method, with motive, and with malice. But still, those tapes kept circulating. Sean's message, now reframed as a warning to the youth of America, gained momentum during the 90s. The satanic panic had cooled somewhat, but echoes of it remained in rural churches and in suburban fears. Parents who once locked their children's Dungeons and Dragons manuals away now invited Sean Sellers' cautionary recordings into their living rooms. The killer had become, if not forgotten, at least useful. But beneath the veneer of redemption, controversy persisted. Was his transformation genuine, or was it a polished attempt to delay the inevitable? Those who knew the victims bristled at the image of Sean smiling in tapes, quoting scripture and speaking of peace. Robert Bauer's family, the Circle K clerk murdered for what amounted to thrill, also remained unconvinced. So too did those who remembered Vonda and Lee, gunned down in their sleep by the boy they'd raised. No sermon could resurrect them. Some prosecutors accused Sean of weaponizing remorse, of learning the language of rehabilitation while never facing the full weight of his actions. In private, a few correctional officers admitted they liked him. He was polite, he was thoughtful, soft-spoken, not the cold-eyed killer they expected. But even they wondered how much of that was survival instinct. As his execution date loomed, national attention returned. Documentaries aired, editorials debated, politicians weighed in. And yet, nothing moved the legal machinery that had locked Sean Sellers' fate into place. He was no longer the youngest inmate on death row now, but he remained the most controversial. His was a test case, not just for juvenile justice, but for redemption itself. Could a killer change? And if so, should it even matter? In his final years, Sellers redoubled his efforts. He continued to write, to speak, and to warn. He didn't plead for release, but just for reconsideration. "I am not that boy," he wrote. "I am not that broken mind. I'm more." His story now existed in paradox, a boy who killed and a man who preached. A system that judged him not for what he became, but for what he had done. Chapter 5, The Executioner's Prayer. February 5th, 1999. After 13 years on death row, Sean Sellers walked his last mile. He was 29 years old. That morning began as so many others had during his years of confinement. Under the watchful gaze of correctional officers, in a concrete cell chilled by institutional indifference. But this day carried a different weight. There were no more legal motions, no more clemency petitions waiting in file drawers. The great machinery of justice had reached its final cog. There was only the end. He had once been the boy who painted his eyelids black, who called himself the demon prince Ezerate, who claimed to kill under the influence of Satan. But in 13 years behind bars, the shadows had shifted. Gone were the trappings of occultism. In their place, scripture, prayer, communion. Sean Sellers refused a last meal, opting instead for a simple ritual: bread, wine, the Eucharist, and silence. A priest anointed his forehead with oil. Sean bowed his head, not as a child of darkness, but, at least by his own reckoning, as a servant of Christ. There were no final indulgences, no dramatic gestures, only the careful, resigned rhythm of a man who knew his hour had come. At precisely 12:01 a.m., the curtain in the execution chamber drew open. Fluorescent lights revealed the sterile tableau. A gurney bolted to the floor, an IV stand, a wall of glass behind which observers had gathered. Journalists sat in silence. Representatives from the district attorney's office and the victims' families stared without blinking. And there was Sean, strapped to the gurney, his body blanketed by a white sheet pulled up to the collarbone. He wore wire-framed glasses. His hair was thinner than it had been as a teenager, receding slightly at the temples. His face bore the lines of a man who had spent nearly half his life in the company of steel doors and state-issued uniforms. He didn't look like the boy who had killed. A prison official asked if he had any last words. "Yes, I do," Sean said. He began slowly, deliberately. He said he was sorry, not as a hollow formality, but as a broken man trying to bind together the splinters of what remained. He apologized to the families of Robert Bauer, of Vonda and Lee Bellafato. "There's no way my words can heal the pain I've caused," he said, his voice wavering but firm. "But I hope, through Christ, you can find peace." He turned slightly, facing the glass as if searching for something in their eyes, a flicker of mercy maybe, or some understanding. There are some who say they saw it. Others say he looked past them, into a space only he could see. At 12:08 a.m., the execution began. First came sodium thiopental, a barbiturate meant to render him unconscious. Then pancuronium bromide to paralyze. Finally, potassium chloride to stop the heart. At 12:17 a.m., Sean Sellers was pronounced dead. Outside in the winter dark, a crowd had gathered. A few dozen people, activists holding candles, students from nearby universities, clergy clutching their rosaries. Some sang hymns, others carried signs reading, "Thou shalt not kill," or "Justice for victims." There were no clashes, there was no shouting, just the weight of history closing on itself. The Oklahoma Department of Corrections issued a brief statement. Sentence carried out according to protocol. No elaboration, no comment on the protests, no mention of the controversies that had surrounded the case for over a decade. In the bureaucratic record, it was a footnote, just another name crossed off. But behind that finality lingered the complexity. Sean Sellers hadn't died in silence. In the years since his trial, he'd become something rare, a condemned man whose case had been adopted by human rights organizations across the globe. Amnesty International cited him often in campaigns against juvenile executions. The American Bar Association referenced his story when lobbying for reform. The United Nations condemned his sentence as a violation of international standards. In Europe, his story was recounted with outrage. In American living rooms, it sparked debates about mercy and retribution. Even within the U.S. justice system, whispers circulated. Had the courts failed to evolve? Had they ignored signs of dissociative mental illness? Could redemption mean anything if it didn't matter at the gallows? Sean's defenders described him as a reformed man, a cautionary tale, a Christian witness. His detractors saw something different. A manipulative killer who cloaked himself in salvation when the tide turned. He was smart, one prosecutor recalled. Too smart. He knew exactly what he was doing then, and he knew exactly what to say in the years that followed. But even the most jaded admitted, the Sean who died was not the same boy who pulled the trigger. Whether that mattered depended on your faith. Whether your faith in God, your faith in the justice system, or your faith in a person's ability to change. In the months that followed, the execution echoed in quiet spaces. Legal scholars debated, church groups hosted vigils. His tapes, those sermons from a prison cell, continued to circulate. They warned of evil, of darkness, of the cost of unchecked rage. In Oklahoma City, a mother visited the grave of her murdered son, still unconvinced that forgiveness required release. In a prison archive, a box of Sellers' letters remained sealed, labeled Inmate 112292. Pages filled with scripture, with apologies, with pleas, read by no one. And in the minds of many, the image persisted. A boy with a gun, a man with a prayer, a system with no room for both. Because the question still stands, can a killer truly change? And if he does, should we let him? That's not a legal question. That's a human question. And it's the one the law, even now, can't fully answer. Chapter 6, The Legacy of Sean Sellers. Today, the name Sean Sellers remains etched in American criminal history. Not just as a killer, but as a case study in the complexities of justice, media hysteria, adolescent development, and the elusive idea of redemption. He was the boy who murdered in the name of Satan, the teen who turned to Christ behind bars, and the man whose death raised more questions than it answered. Sean Richard Sellers holds a singular place in the legal annals of the United States. He was the first person executed for crimes committed under the age of 17 since the death penalty was reinstated in 1976. That fact alone made him a lightning rod. Across courtrooms, across classrooms, across churches, and policy debates, his name surfaced with uncomfortable frequency, sparking arguments that transcended the simple boundaries of guilt and punishment. For legal scholars and activists, Sellers' case was a turning point. They pointed to it during debates that eventually culminated in Roper versus Simmons in 2005, when the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that executing juvenile offenders was unconstitutional. That landmark decision came 6 years too late for Sean Sellers. By then, his ashes had been scattered, his story largely consigned to crime documentaries and cautionary tales. But his shadow loomed over that courtroom, invoked both as a tragedy and a warning. Even beyond the law, Sellers became a kind of cultural cipher. For evangelical Christians, his story was a testament to the power of God's forgiveness. Churches across America played his taped testimonies for youth groups and Sunday schools. And they didn't sanitize his past. They presented it in full, as proof that even the most heinous sinner can be brought to the foot of the cross. He was their proof of concept, a murderer turned minister. Meanwhile, mental health advocates pointed to Sellers as a failure of diagnosis and treatment. Remember, the term dissociative identity disorder had been raised at his trial, but it was dismissed. Over the years, experts revisited his case, suggesting that trauma, mental illness, and adolescent instability were all present, but ignored. Sellers became a poster child, not just for what happens when systems fail, but for how those failures compound with time. For the American justice system, the case was a stark reminder that laws are written with clarity, but applied with bias. At the time of his execution, international treaties forbade the death penalty for crimes committed under 18. But the U.S. remained one of the few Western nations willing to overlook that fact. Oklahoma held firm. The courts refused to budge. And in doing so, they etched Sean's story into a larger conversation about when punishment ceases to be justice and becomes something colder, something more performative. But perhaps the most important voices, the ones often overlooked, are those of the victims' families. To them, Sean Sellers wasn't a case or a cause. He was the boy who murdered a beloved mother, a husband, a store clerk. No amount of televised apologies could erase the horror of what he'd done. And for many of them, watching him grow older in prison, finding faith, making statements, becoming a public figure, only deepened their grief. To Robert Bauer's family, Sean had taken not just a life, but an entire future. To Vonda and Lee Belafato's relatives, he'd violated the sanctuary of home, turning their bed into an altar of death. Their loss was not theoretical. It was raw, it was intimate, and it was irreversible. And while others debated psychology, theology, or jurisprudence, they had to mourn. So that well-trod cultural context surrounding Sellers' crimes, what we know as the Satanic Panic, has since receded into the archives of American fear. In the 1980s, communities were gripped by paranoia that devil worship lurked in basements and daycares and in music. Sean, draped in black robes and surrounded by sigils, became the perfect avatar for that hysteria. His story was weaponized by media, by preachers, by politicians, and like many symbols, he became larger than himself. But in the decades since, that panic has evolved. It wears different clothes now. The symbols change, the fears adapt. Yet the Sellers case still surfaces, especially when the nation asks itself how to treat children who commit unthinkable crimes. In prisons and in juvenile facilities across the country, echoes of Sean's story are still heard. In debates about rehabilitation, versus retribution, in calls to reevaluate sentencing laws for minors, in academic papers that ask, what does it mean to be culpable at 16 years old? And what does it mean to change at 29? In a letter written just days before his execution, Sean offered what would become his final reflection. I was a monster. I became a man. If nothing else, let that mean something. It's a line that resists easy interpretation. Was it an acknowledgement of guilt? A plea for grace? A summary of a life he spent trying to rewrite? The world has moved on since that February morning in 1999. The prison in McAllister still stands. Those tapes, they still circulate in church basements. The legal textbooks may have turned to new cases, but in those spaces where law meets morality, where trauma meets theology, the ghost of Sean Sellers still lingers. He's a question or a warning, and he's a test. And like all tests, the answer says more about us than it does about him. Email us at info@evocreative.com and follow @thedevilwithinpod on Instagram. And leave a review, especially if you believe in second chances, even for the damned. The Devil Within is an EVO production, recorded live at Bel Air Studios in Los Angeles, California. For The Devil Within, I'm your writer and host, Brandon Morgan.